We've got a great program this morning. I think you're going to enjoy all three of the speakers. The Hilton and Sally Dean Institute for Corporate Governance and Integrity was founded in 2008 through a generous endowment by Hilton and Sally Dean. Hilton is a former vice chairman of Ernst & Young Worldwide and a former chairman of our Board of Trustees here at Lipscomb University. Sally, who is a professor of accounting herself, is a current trustee of Lipscomb, so we appreciate their friendship to the university and particularly to the Dean Institute. The mission of the Dean Institute is to provide thought leadership, networking opportunities, and educational programming at the local, national, and international levels on the important boardroom issues that lie at the vital intersection of doing things right, that's the governance piece, and doing the right things, that's the integrity piece. So today's program, as well as today's luncheon, which will recognize 9 companies and 9 leaders who exemplify these virtues, is an initiative within the Doing Things Right mission. Today we hope to share ideas, to inspire, and perhaps to give you an opportunity to share some email addresses and some phone numbers among each other. This is a group of people committed to do the right things and to do things right. And so we hope that you all will get to know each other, and we hope this will inspire you to create that new phrase, the triple bottom line. We're all focused now, of course, not only on profits, but also on people and planet. And this is what our mission today is all about. So today we focus on the people part as we start this program. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, there is one group in the audience that I really would like to recognize specifically. Lots of groups I could recognize, but we have a group of academic leaders who are on the campus to meet later today among themselves and then to be a part of the Christian Scholars Conference, which starts tomorrow. We'll have about 600 scholars from around the world here beginning tomorrow. If you're an academic leader and a part of that group, would you just stand and allow us to recognize you today? Thank you all for being here. These are deans and provosts, maybe a VP or so thrown in there somewhere, but academic leaders from prestigious educational institutions around the country. For those of you not familiar with the academic customs, as I was not when I became a dean 6.5 years ago, provosts are the supervisors of deans. Now, deans say to provosts, "You're not the boss of me," but they really are. So thank you all for being here and for supporting this event. And Craig Bledsoe, our provost, thank you for allowing them to join us for the morning session. Now, I'm delighted to introduce my friend Ted Mollick. I hope you received 2 books in your welcome packet this morning. We'll talk about Mike Esterday, and Ron Willingham and integrity selling in the 21st century later this morning. But first we focus on Doing Virtuous Business by Ted Mollick, and we're delighted to have Ted. Ted and I met a couple of years ago in New Orleans at a conference of business deans, business college deans. Ted moderated that forum in New Orleans and then invited me to join a similar group last summer at Yale University. And so we've become friends, and I think you will become his friend this morning. Theodore Roosevelt Mollick is an amazing gentleman. He is a cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, so he comes by the name honestly. He goes by Ted, which tells you a lot about his humility. He's written 14 books. You have one of those this morning. In fact, some of you perhaps got a book other than Doing Virtuous Business. This one is actually out of print, and so we had to kind of scrounge around, and we got several of his other books. If you would like Doing Virtuous Business, it can be downloaded at iBooks or Kindle. I think it's about $10, something like that. But everybody should have gotten one of his books in addition to the Integrity Selling book. He came from Germany last night, where he's writing a 15th book this summer, and he will be headed to Oxford University this fall, where he will become the leader of their business ethics program at Oxford, having left Yale for that new position in England this fall. So would you join with me in welcoming not only to the Lipscomb campus, but to Nashville, Tennessee, Dr. Ted Mollick.
was going to start by saying Villa Donks, Mana, Dominant Herren, but then I remembered what country I was really in. So maybe I should start with another line, stealing it from President Kennedy, Ich bin ein Tennessean. I'm a bit jet lagged. I traveled about 15 hours yesterday, and I woke up at 2 a.m. this morning. Of course, I'm operating on a different time zone, so hopefully my eyes are not as red as they feel. A common element of the Western intellectual landscape for the last century or so has been the widespread, I would argue, pervasive, negative characterization of business as it is conducted on the model of free enterprise capitalism, namely that the enterprise of business is inherently rapacious and selfish. Some of us call this the negative business narrative. You're very well aware of it. We confront it every day in the media, in politics. I certainly see it every day in the academy, where I sit. To be sure, there has been a bountiful supply of robber barons, rascals to fuel this characterization, wolves of Wall Street. And we can stipulate that sufficient numbers of rapacious business persons will always exist, allowing the characterization to live on in the headlines at least. This is actually the theme of my most recent book on economic vice. My students love to talk about vice more than the virtues. The End of Ethics, very scary topic, which provides a rich case study on the worst of the worst, particularly after the financial crisis of 2008, from Madoff to LIBOR to MF Global, and unfortunately the list goes on. But, and I underline this word 3 times in my script, is the negative business narrative truly or totally accurate? Is there not a remarkable disconnect between it and the innumerable, largely positive, mutually beneficial experiences that we all have every day, every week around the globe with a great variety of businesses, large and small? Most of us know that most businesses generally provide quality goods, good services, for which we're quite willing to pay what we end up paying. We also know that most businesses will go to considerable lengths and beyond to retain us as happy, returning so-called loyal customers. Many businesses, and you don't hear this in the press because of that negative narrative, are simply put good. Well, in Jim Collins' world, I guess a few are great. So which is it? Is free enterprise, responsible capitalism inherently, essentially selfish and rapacious or not? For those who still believe in logic, this question presents a clear decision mechanism. If business on the free enterprise capitalist model is inherently rapacious and selfish, then any business built on a contrary model, think about those models, models of service, models of goodwill, models of community, models of responsibility, models of integrity, models of social entrepreneurship, etc., must be inherently disadvantaged in their competition to survive. So this would be the test. Is it possible for a significant number of successful businesses to be organized on models that are contrary to the negative business narrative? If so, then the negative business narrative is false. Selfishness and rapaciousness are not inherent in free enterprise, responsible capitalism, and we can confidently and fruitfully teach to a richer, better model. I call it a model of economic virtue or virtuous capitalism. Now, in light of this challenge, I hope it is highly encouraging for you, and I thank your dean, and I see my own old book here in front of me, to encounter this little book, which was republished, actually. You might not know that. They took the spiritual enterprise title off, and a company here in Tennessee called Thomas Nelson republished it as Doing Virtuous Business. And this little slim book was aimed at a wide audience. I think 75,000 people bought the book, so it got to be wider and wider. Don't be misled. Many corner office types have certainly properly read it. It has also provided a share of scholarly studies, even, I'm proud to say, harsh critics on the left. It seems I speak on it nearly every week. I've spoken now to date in the last 3 years to 65 business schools worldwide on almost every continent on precisely this topic. On websites, on TV shows, you can Google it, it comes up, yes. Achieving either one of these objectives is rare enough, but the book has done both because, first of all, it demonstrates that virtuous leadership leads to business success. And secondly, it helps us to recover the vision of free enterprise, responsible capitalism as wholly consistent with spiritual depth and moral commitment. Now, there's plenty here for both the business practitioner and the business theorist, political economist, since I personally and by experience cross all those domains, all those lines. Now, I was motivated to write this book to counter that negative business narrative while encouraging those in business. And I ran for 10 years the PricewaterhouseCoopers CEO Learning Partnership. So particularly CEOs, although it's not only CEOs I'm writing for, to develop their spiritual understanding. The nature of their, and I'll use the old-fashioned word, Beruf in German, calling and practice as business persons. I believe that defenders of responsible capitalism have tended to miss the spiritual dimension. Therefore, I try to display the spiritual dimension powerfully by introducing the classical concept of virtue. Now, a virtue, and my students at Yale don't know what a virtue is, so I usually have to tell them. They do know the vices a little bit better. It's a virtue is a habit that makes one a better person for possessing that habit. I think it's similar for a firm. Firms that possess virtues become habituated to those virtues. And I introduced the virtues, including, of course, faith, hope, and charity, courage, perseverance, discipline, compassion, humility, 14 in total. And I copiously try to illustrate each one with extended stories, biographical vignettes of successful leaders of businesses, enterprises whose leadership has strongly exhibited the virtue in question. I trust I successfully make the case that virtuous leadership creates a strong, focused organization. One is not only financially successful, although it is, but also ethically and good over a long, not a short term. Now, many reviewers of my book, advocates of virtue ethics from philosophy or from the business field of ethics, find the application of the virtues to leadership and business management a significant new development. This has been unexplored, frankly, for the last 150 years. And I conclude the book with a concise spreadsheet. So those of you who are accountants and want to run to that, we crunched all the numbers. We showed that operating a major business is conspicuously interesting when you do it in virtuous ways because it's entirely compatible with flourishing enterprises. In many cases, the businesses that either dominate their competitors, outperform their competitors, and we did all the analysis, there are 60 companies in the list of companies we studied, they also outperformed the S&P 500 10-year index. Some of them did both. They didn't do it by 1 or 2%. They did it by between 20 and 24%. That virtue pays, I think, was an interesting finding. This very readable book has ideas, as I say, practical guidance, compelling numbers, and that's why it's become a calling card for me, synonymous with work I've been doing over the last years. PBS asked me about 3 years ago to turn the book into an hour-long documentary that numerous foundations and sponsors underwrote. I always thank people who underwrite things, and I'm glad the dean did that at the beginning, because without that it's not possible to do much. And which aired about 1.5 years ago nationally in primetime PBS television to 15 million viewers like you. So if you haven't seen the documentary, I encourage you to have a peek of it. You can see it at doingvirtuousbusiness.com online. In showcasing the virtues at the heart of leadership practice, I'm doing something that sounds new and fresh. But here I have to confess, as a reader of the great books, that this was actually done long ago. It was done by Aristotle. It was done by Aquinas. It was done by Adam Smith. It was done by Immanuel Kant. They did it long before I did it, providing a strong basis in what they called, and I would recall, personal character for the success of spiritually or ethically attuned businesses. But even so, this approach is only a natural development from the values-oriented approach of leadership that is at this point well established in leadership thinking. You know some of those books. The Leadership Challenge, a prominent one, listed 20 most admired characteristics in leadership, fully half of which are bona fide virtues, I think. More generally, most good values are either virtues themselves, such as honesty, or close cousins, such as commitment. My approach is also highly amenable to and foundational to other well-researched understandings of business ethics and leadership. These include those deriving from specific religious traditions. I think best and classically exemplified by my friend who wrote the foreword to this book, and I recommend the foreword alone, the Catholic theologian, philosopher Michael Novak, who's really in his last days these days. His gem of a book, Business as a Calling, Work and the Examined Life, is also in this tradition. And the servant leadership movement, which you probably know, some of you who have studied leadership, the work of Robert Greenleaf, and also I would note Max Dupree's leadership work, which straddles certainly both of the above, and I write at length about a company that he was CEO of, Herman Miller, when I talk about the virtue of respect, because they do it better than any other company, I think, on the face of the planet. I would also note here thanks, and a very large thanks, to a Tennessean. Sir John Templeton and his Templeton Foundation, of course, has funded my work for over a decade. He was one of the greatest investors of the last century. And he made possible, his foundation made possible, my most recent work at Yale. For the last 4 years I've been there, and we've been able to extend this work. I had 4 superlative postdocs, that is, people who work for you after they get their PhD and actually multiply your work many times over. And we were able to extend this work on spiritual capital at Yale. The result of that work is 28 new case studies for use by MBA students on what we term practical wisdom for management. And here's a news flash. This new book is coming out in July, those 28 case studies, which is really meant for university MBA type programs, because the argument was we don't have a pedagogy to teach the cases of good companies. Now we have some of that. And across different spiritual traditions, so let me be honest about this, different philosophical orientations, from A to Z, everything from Anabaptists to Zoroastrians. That will confuse some people. My focus on virtue is foundational to all other approaches to enterprise leadership, including all those of the excellent books I've just mentioned, because it shows leaders how to develop the personal character to ably lead their institutions in reaching those destinations. The 2 distinguishing marks of virtue-oriented thinking are, first, the recognition that the best plans and ideas or rules are worth little unless one possesses the personal character necessary to see them through. And secondly, personal character ultimately consists of habits of life. Those of us in the faith would say habits of the soul, which equip one to conduct a morally successful life, a life worthy of the richest notion of honor. Now, this terribly important distinction is reflected in the basic organization of that book. Other management leadership books are organized around the themes of business management, operational leadership, functional leadership. I'm not depreciating them. That is themes of how the manager or the leader should work, should function, the kinds of emphasis he or she should have, the kinds of actions he or she should take. In contrast, I organized this book around various virtues, habits of life that make for success, defined as goodness, showing how successful leaders actually have built enterprises upon them. Often the issue with an enterprise leader is not what should be done, but rather how to become the kind of person that can actually do what should be done. In addressing the virtues, I'm taking us to the foundation. What kind of person should one be as a leader, as one leads an enterprise, any enterprise, large or small, public or private, in any industry? Frankly, I believe, and I've been to 141 of these in any country around the world, what kind of enterprise shall this be? Here, the turn to virtues is, again, I would argue, absolutely essential. Spiritual enterprise begins boldly at the most important point, one that could be considered highly controversial, I admit, within the world of business and certainly within the academy in which I sit in a secular university. I forthrightly affirm that we are spiritual beings, and that this dimension does or ought to color all that we do, including our business. I refer to this principal distinction of our lives by coining a new and exciting concept, which I guess I'm now considered the father of, so I'll take credit for fathering this concept: spiritual capital, which I explain as being analogous to the concepts of social and human capital. Social capital is, and I quote, the accumulated social resources inherited by each new generation from its predecessor, including customs, language, manners, morals, in short, the practices and networks really underscored today as we live in a digital age, that are taught to us by our parents in order to make us fit members of society. Social capital. Remember my friend Robert Putnam from Harvard, who reminded us, should we or should we not bowl alone? He was onto something. Human capital, thank you to the now late Nobel Prize-winning economist Gary Becker, died just last month, consists of the skills, experience, knowledge embodied in human beings, human betterment, if you will, education, underscoring that play an indispensable part in the generation of the human being and profitable enterprise. Human capital. Analogous to these, I define spiritual capital as the fund of beliefs, examples, and commitments that are transmitted from generation to generation through a religious tradition, which attach people to the transcendental source of human happiness. Amplifying this, I say, we are moral beings in all the ways that Adam Smith describes, but we are also spiritual beings. We seek out the transcendental source of our values. We join with others in acts of worship and prayer. Through spiritual discipline, habit, and exercise, we absorb the legacy of spiritual knowledge that is contained in a religious tradition. That's a description of spiritual capital. Now, while social capital derives from social interactions, I note a different source for spiritual capital. It comes from an altogether other relationship, a relationship other than that in human society. That relationship is with God. The reaching out towards God through worship, prayer, devotion, pious observance are a special kind of discipline, which is not the discipline of human society. It involves an act of metaphysical submission, a bowing down, if you will, of the whole spirit to a power that lies beyond the work of our own perception. I then begin to show how this spiritual capital connects with our conduct in our professional environments. And of course, the corporation is one of those environments. And it shows how serious I am about putting one's business on a spiritual basis, as has been modeled by many of the companies you've listed here, and I'm sure you interact with at this school, with people like Truett Cathy, Chick-fil-A, my friend Max Dupree and his ancestors at Herman Miller, Bill Pollard at ServiceMaster. The list goes on and on. And the good news is that there are more and more of these. When you write about this, people send you emails almost every week telling you about new companies, small companies, startup companies, vibrant companies, and in different faith traditions. Exciting. The posture of spiritual reception, whereby the individual opens his or her heart to an otherworldly form of obedience, is the core of piety, and it provides unique forms of practical knowledge. For example, the knowledge of what to do and how to behave in circumstances where the existing grid of social mores does not run. The knowledge of how to forgive someone who has tried to destroy you. The knowledge of how to ask for forgiveness for your own recognized faults. It also begins with thankful praise and leads to humility and gratitude. As Max Dupree once said, the first and the last word, the true word of leadership, is thanks. It sets both the direction and motivation. I build on the leader's commitment to spiritual capital and virtues and show how it can extend to the enterprise itself. When a leader of character similarly establishes his or her enterprise on a virtuous characteristic, that virtue makes a tangible impact on the entire organization. I say it gets baked in, even by the founders, in the very DNA of those companies. And that virtue makes a tangible impact on an entire organization, earning it genuine respect. It becomes a kind of business in which people are admirably joined. People really are attracted to these companies. I describe how the virtue of faith, for instance, plays out in the corporate life of Interstate Battery Systems of America, a highly successful business. The top leadership shares a vibrant faith, which it openly and courageously shares. That faith colors decision-making, the way that the business is conducted, honesty and in trust towards the goal of serving. Serving who? Serving God. Exactly like St. Paul's fruits of the Spirit, the fruits of spiritual capital, according to my assessment, are the virtues. I take readers on a tour of 14 virtues, so there's a little theory here. For applied books such as this, I serve as a kind of tour guide. I'm a business tour guide, providing good introductions, lots of stops, plenty of inspirational stories, not too long in any one place, lots of good pictures, very colorful. My presentations of the virtues are generally clear, winsome. You see why each virtue makes one a better person, a better leader for possessing that habit of the soul, and how it affects the firms where it comes to play. And the stories I tell are, well, they're all real. None of them are fictional. They're all highly inspirational. They're innumerable. Actually, they only seem innumerable. There are only 60 of them. As I said, I get more and more stories every week from people around the world who believe that enterprise leadership, in fact, illustrating the virtues, is on the ascent. And I believe that it is. More and more people in our secular societies looking for that foundational basis. Most of the stories concern I am myself a Christian, so they concern Christian leaders from different Christian traditions, Catholic and Protestant. But I also believe that most religions, and I've come to this even more radically recently, at least the significant religious traditions possess significant spiritual capital to bequeath to their followers, and accordingly, I recount several stories of virtuous leadership and those of business persons from other faith traditions all over the world. In classic virtue ethics fashion, the stories are, of course, the heart of the message, and they certainly deliver the case. They also reveal a grasp and a scope of contemporary business and economics, because this is real life. This is not made up. It's not fiction. Truthfully, I dwell longest on the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, because they are the basis of the spiritually attuned life, and I believe of a business that's likewise aligned. And it is very inspiring indeed to see how many devout Christians have courageously made their faith a key part of their organization's values and business systems. Next, I introduce what I call the hard virtues. You're more familiar with these. The virtues that we would identify as being, frankly, more masculine in tone: leadership, courage, perseverance, discipline. The virtues that, well, to be blunt, help you get the job done. Most business people accept those. If they don't call them virtues, they realize them nonetheless. And last, I take us on a tour through what I call the soft virtues. The virtues that are more readily identified sometimes as being more feminine: virtues of justice, compassion, forgiveness, gratitude, and foremost, humility. And I would acknowledge that we are apt to look at these as stay-at-home virtues. Many people don't think they belong in the work environment, that they have nothing to do with capitalism, its practice in its most competitive form, which is exactly what the leftist critics of capitalism want us to say, that these softer virtues have no place in the system of business. But the evidence of this book constitutes a substantial refutation of those critics. In wrapping up this quick look at my treatment of the virtues, it might be good to hear something directly on one of the soft virtues, one of the important virtues, Sir John's favorite virtue, the virtue of gratitude. Note how in this passage I not only analyze the relationship of which the virtue is part, but also clearly detail how this attitude impacts the business environment. Gratitude and business. Did you ever put those two things together? The response to gift is not resentment, but gratitude, by which is meant a going out to meet the giver, a reciprocal offer of the self and its fund of goodwill. We are not demeaned by gratitude, but raised by it to a condition of equality with the giver. We are saying to the one who bestows a gift on us, I too would give if I could, and meanwhile, I give what I can to you. In the context of business, such an attitude, far from displaying weakness, is a source, maybe a secret source, of strength. It fosters an open and honest approach to others, whether allies or competitors. It imbues the day-to-day operation of a business with a lightness, a cheerfulness that helps to release the potential in that business, the potential of those employees, those potential of everyone who comes in contact with that company. In this passage, and in countless others in the book, I try to reveal a powerful blend of practical wisdom and business insight. Let me end by saying the relationship of spiritual capital, and therefore our religious faith, is tied to the virtues. This is not just an issue of academic importance. We are all aware that virtuous ethics has flourished in cultural traditions that are relatively impoverished in spiritual terms. For example, the Homeric ancient Greek civilization. Furthermore, one can be virtuous without being religious and religious without being particularly virtuous. So how do higher levels of spiritual tuning, to use an academic phrase, tend to lead to higher levels of virtue? Good question. The answer is two-part, of which the second at least is implicit in the questions and the quotations I cited above from the pages in that book. First, when the God whom one worships is truly great and good, as is the God of Judaism of the Old Testament and Christianity in the New Testament, the corresponding standards of character to which the believer is called are greater. No one ever accused Zeus of being all-loving or merciful. Second, the relationship of worshipful submission to a great and good God opens up in the believer the spiritual space, the psychological space, the ethical space, I would say freedom from one's own ego or narcissism, to develop the whole range of subtler virtues, the theological virtues, the soft virtues, which are less frequently promoted in the ethical traditions outside, frankly, the world of Judeo-Christian thought. And second, since at least the time of Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, virtue ethicists have noted a distinction between primary and secondary virtues. The former, honesty, faith, justice, gratitude, are virtues which always make one a better person for possessing them, regardless of other dimensions of one's character, while the latter, courage, loyalty, perseverance, discipline, and the like, make one overall a more excellent person only if also possessing the primary virtues in good measure. These virtues fit together. There's an orbit, in other words, of virtues. For a negative example of this, not to pick on accountants, but I like to do this, consider a CPA who is a disciplined, perseverant, and loyal CPA to his CEO, whom he knows to be unscrupulous and overall a more dangerous person to society than if he were undisciplined, lazy, and rather disloyal to his unscrupulous boss. Ultimately, as Plato indirectly shows in the Republic, there is a hierarchy of virtues. A truly excellent person needs to possess more or less all of the virtues. I would say that's the case for the firms that I studied as well. But that does not mean that all the virtues are of equal priority, or certainly that all the virtues exist to the same extent in any given individual or any given firm. In fact, I'm writing another book right now, as the dean said, as a visiting professor at the very famous Weltethos Institute at Tübingen University, the Global Ethics Institute in Germany, on a cardinal and a critical virtue that I believe has become totally neglected, is almost totally gone from our business vocabulary today, namely prudence. Prudent business. What was once termed practical reason, or by Aquinas himself, phronesis. I intend all of my books as well suited as primary texts for leadership, entrepreneurship, political economy courses. They could be used in business economics courses, certainly. They're used as secondary texts in virtue ethics courses because they show how the virtues penetrate all of life. But most importantly, what I'm writing to, and I'm really frankly a recovering academic because most of my career was in diplomacy and politics and philanthropy on Wall Street and for 20 years running a strategic strategy firm. I'm writing for business persons, like many of you, who are striving to be virtuous and to build cultures of integrity and firms that can profitably read and learn from the example of others. So I trust, as intended, that this book has indeed shown that business is a spiritual enterprise. Given the society, particularly our radically secularized society in which we find ourselves today, those of us who care deeply about spiritual matters must consider this kind of book and others like it, and this kind of argument to be of the utmost importance. Thank you for appreciating my humble work, for putting on this one-day show, integrity and conversation that brings us together, and for giving me this esteemed, distinctive award, which I guess we'll do later at lunch, unless you decide not to give it to me. Godspeed to each and every one of you.
Ted, thank you. Outstanding presentation. We have about 10 minutes and we'd like to take some questions from the audience. We have a microphone, but I know it's not accessible to everyone in the room, so if you don't feel comfortable coming to the microphone, just stand where you are and I'll repeat the question for the videotape. Let me ask the first question. Ted, when I returned from New Orleans, the meeting that I referred to earlier, and then last summer when I returned from the meeting at Yale, I brought with me your concepts in your book and I shared those with our faculty. And they decided to change our mission statement in the College of Business. And it was largely your fault, or to your credit. So our new mission statement, and this is in a Christian institution that has been around since 1891, where we've tried to instill the highest academic skills as well as integrity for all of those years. But we've become bold enough now to use the mission statement that our intent in the College of Business is to develop business leaders who embrace the virtues and values of Jesus. Will you react to that? Is that too bold in today's politically correct society?
I'm not afraid of being bold, as you well know, so I think that at a place like this, it's encouraging to hear, and I've heard of similar impacts at numerous other campuses in different religious traditions and frankly different continents. So there is a movement afoot. Some of that has to do with the reaction to what we've come through in the most recent economic recession, the outrageous behavior, frankly, of what I call economic vice. And I think as well, and someone won the Nobel Prize in economics for this a number of years ago, I think we're in the wakes of another great reawakening of faith. So in that, to that extent, I think you're riding the crest of that wave. And we need more places like this, more business schools like this, more students being brought up in that tradition, frankly, the only way you're going to get a new generation of leadership is to nurture those leaders. It's not going to happen. It has to be trained, has to be cultivated. I spend time at some of these elite institutions with some of the very best students, frankly, in the world. 50 students trying to get one place. But frankly, and I hope this is being recorded, not many of them know the definition of virtue.
And we very specifically chose the word Jesus as opposed to Christ or Christian because we thought the word Christian implied division and denominations. And we thought that the virtues and values of Jesus were qualities that anyone could embrace, even people who perhaps aren't Christians. Do you agree with that
I do.
choice?
And you find, I travel the world a lot, so some of my examples tend to be out on the fringe here, where you find Hindu followers of Jesus in India. I find that fascinating. I go to places and there are Zoroastrians, people in the Parsi tradition who are reading the Bible. My friend at Yale, Miroslav Volf, has written fairly comprehensive works about Islam and Christianity and reconciliation and conversation. Obviously, that's been going on for many generations with Judaism. So there is a great fascination today in many circles because of, I would say, the spread of evangelical faith, the resurgence probably within Catholic circles with the new Pope, and a new generation of young people who are trying to understand who Jesus was, and can be in their lives. So that is very exciting.
Thank you for that affirmation. Let's take some questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Pope Francis. He's captured a lot of headlines through comments about business. And I wondered if you might comment on what you think he's really saying, and if you had a conversation with him, what you would talk about related to his view of business, concern for the poor, and so forth.
Well, I haven't had the ability to have that conversation yet, although I'm very close to a number of Catholic scholars who not only work in the Vatican, on different institutes, been influential on some encyclicals, are certainly privy to those conversations. I'm not in the Catholic tradition, so I'm not, as I say, within that inner circle, but I've been part of numerous conferences where Caritas, has been discussed, and that, of course, that's the last Pope, and now the new Pope, and his really bending over, I think, to consider the principles and need of the poor. So I think there's a great deal of sympathy. I certainly have a great deal of sympathy for that tradition. There is, I would say, sometimes I would note a kind of lack of understanding of economics, though, frankly, in the documents. So I wish they would consult just a few more economists before they put out the National Council of Churches or the World Council of Churches puts out similar kinds of documents. I don't think they consult nearly enough practitioners or economists, and I think if they, which I have always tried to do in my work, if you tapped into that real life experience, not only would you get a richer view, but you would get something closer to the truth.
All right, maybe time for a couple of more.
Thank you so much for your comments. They were very enlightening. As a CEO of an organization that is faith-based, I struggle with forgiveness versus consequences. For example, you've got a president of a division that is doing an outstanding job and then finds himself in bandy in recovery and then gone for 4 months to rehab. Do you forgive them? Or do because you are the judge and jury, whether they get to come back to life or not. And being a Christian organization, you struggle with what's the right way to handle something. And so could you just speak about that inner conflict that we deal with when we're leading organizations?
Well, I think you've just spoken about it very articulately. It's an inner struggle. So it's frankly, I find most of these things are not black and white. They're certainly not easy. There's no one cookie-cutter approach. There might be a situation where you have to, frankly, remove such a person because they're doing harm to your company, to its brand, to its culture, to, the whole value chain or the value proposition. There are other cases where you can bring somebody back in, you know, at a different level and a different relationship. I don't think there's one easy answer to that, but I think what you articulated is that tension in human life, and particularly in a Christian life, between living in virtue and struggling with sin. And frankly, we all find ourselves in that predicament. Just a question of which scale.
Yes, Trevor.
Would you say that economic vice is becoming more diluted as generations start to realize how many times we've messed up? And you think that it will soon be eradicated to a point where we will understand that the person next to us is just as good as we are and we should support those around us?
So now I can talk for another hour and a half about my last book, right? The End of Ethics. My sense is actually quite the opposite. And I'm not typically, I'm a kind of person you know, that always wants to see the glass half full. I mean, I'm basically an optimistic person, and I'm called by Christ to see hope and possibility, and even in darkness to see some light. And there is some light at the end of the tunnel. But when this is a co-authored book I did with a legal scholar, one of my postdocs, when we were writing the book on the end of ethics, it was very depressing. Because you look at the survey research, fewer and fewer people care about ethics. A little bit of cheating, a little bit of lying, a little bit of stealing, nobody will care. Then you look at something like performance-enhancing drugs in the financial industry, and you look at performance-enhancing drugs in athletic contests. And we have Lance Armstrong writ large, frankly, all over our culture. And there are more and more of these examples. And I would like to think we could learn from the past, but as we were writing that book, our editor, which was another very good business editor, Wiley, kept coming back to us and said, well, there's no chapter on MF Global. Oh, well, I have to write a new chapter. There's no chapter on LIBOR. Oh, I have to write a new chapter. You could write a new chapter, unfortunately, in a depressing book like that every 2-3 months. I mean, have we not had enough scandals? Have we learned nothing as a result of, we stared into the abyss in 2008. I don't know how closely we came to something much worse than in fact happened. Did you know that we lost, and in my new book I cite this figure, we lost, and this is a staggering number. When I say this, people don't believe it, $35 trillion as a result of the 2008 financial scandal collapse. Trillion. That's in real assets, stocks, bonds, real estate. That's a whole decade of wealth creation. The loss of jobs in Europe, and they're still coming out of this recession. We're starting a little bit, to do a little bit better in the States. It's a phenomenal loss. The cost is extremely excruciating, and still it seems the lure of the economic vice is so great, whether it's greed or avarice, you name it. It's just so tempting. So we need people who are schooled and disciplined in the virtues to overcome these vices, to be in great institutions, to be captains of industry, to work on Wall Street, and to actually take us down a radically different path. So hopefully there is some light at the end of the tunnel. I think the light at the back of our book, the light at the end of that tunnel is personal responsibility. Part of that has to do with training MBAs. Part of it is how we raise our own children, how they are educated, how they're schooled, how they're churched. Now, many people aren't churched anymore. That's a whole problem in and of itself. It has to do with the main topic this morning, cultures of integrity. How do firms build cultures of integrity which distinguish them? And then finally, and I don't start there, but I actually do believe we have to discuss this, it has to do with regulatory frameworks. So codes of conduct, corporate governance, oversight. I'm a big advocate for doing audits of corporate governance, audits of ethics. We just finished writing a protocol on enterprise-wide risk management. I think you have to do all this stuff. You have to embed that. And some of it, frankly, is going to be legislated.
Ted, I don't want to steal any time from Chip's presentation, but I just have to ask one last question because I think you've opened the door to this. So on the one hand, we have this declining morality in the workplace as well as generally. When I was at Vanderbilt earning my MBA 30 years ago, I heard the term maximize shareholder value 1,000 times. I don't think I ever heard the word ethics in that entire 2-year experience. And I'm not being critical of my alma mater, but that's just the,
It's not an anomaly.
it was the culture
It's
of the
norm.
time.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we have this tension of declining morality. On the other hand, I'm sure there are people in the audience who feel a little uncomfortable because we hear the term workplace evangelism. We hear lots of stories about being politically correct in the workplace. How do you navigate that tension between the need to create a culture of higher integrity versus going too far and making it uncomfortable for people in the workplace?
Yeah, and it's a very good question, and it's not I think one of those bold lines you draw in the sand. So it's a kind of fuzzy line, and frankly, there are different cultures, different companies, different industries that have done it different ways. So I'm not one to put on some kind of uniform standard. I think the distinction between faith-based companies, and here we could talk about any faith or any sub-denomination of a faith, and faith-friendly companies is an interesting one. So for instance, I've done work and I wrote about Tyson Foods at length, so you'll see that in the book. They've chosen to be a faith-friendly company. They have instigated, for instance, and this worked for them. Again, I'm not saying all these things, practices work for everyone. System of workplace chaplains who come from all different faiths and help the workforce in order to find their way and to resolve some of their issues. On the other hand, you find some pretty boldly, proselytizing type companies. I could mention, I like the company a lot, Alaska Airlines. It's a great company. They give out Bible verses when you get on the plane. What's right, what's wrong, I'm not going to judge. I think that there are a lot of different examples. But yeah, I know I once went on CNN and had to defend Chick-fil-A. And I told them about Zoroastrianism, and they were very fascinated.
Ted, thank you so much for coming, all the way from Germany.
Ted, it's a delight to have you here today. And no, we're not going to rescind the award. We will give it at lunch. So thank you for coming all the way from Germany. Now, I hate to burst Ted's bubble about coming from Germany, but we do have a champion traveler who trumped Ted. In fact, we have two with us this morning. Chip and Jackie Connor came all the way from Hong Kong to be with us this morning. And Chip, before I introduce you, may I introduce your better half, Mrs. Chip Connor, Jackie Connor. Would you stand and let us welcome you to Nashville? We are in Stowe Hall, provided about a year ago through a very generous gift from Barry and Sherry Stowe, who are both alums of Lipscomb. They live in Hong Kong. Barry is the chief executive of Prudential Corporation Asia, a major insurance and wealth management firm in Asia. They operate, I believe, in 13 nations in Asia and have about 400,000 agents and employees. I was asked last December by the organizers of the Asia Ethics Summit in Hong Kong to assemble a panel of chief executives from Asia to talk about these types of things. And so I first reached out to Barry, a logical choice because of our friendship and relationship through Lipscomb. And I said, Barry, could you suggest a couple of other executives? And the first name that he suggested and the first person that I reached out to for that panel was William E. Chip Connor. And I'm delighted to tell you that we, on that occasion, developed a friendship. And because of that friendship, I asked Chip to come to Nashville today. First time ever in Nashville. We're delighted that you've been able to sample Music City, USA, and hope you'll come back again. We very much have enjoyed having you here. Chip Connor is an amazing executive. You've read his bio in the program. I won't repeat all of that. He'll talk in just a moment about his sourcing business and how it began and the amazing scope and size. He runs one of the largest sourcing companies in the world. It's a privately owned business owned by Chip and the family members, and it is an amazing enterprise. But I think the thing that has impressed me the most about learning of W. Connor and Associates is the fact that this year, I believe for the third consecutive year, maybe for the fourth consecutive year, Ethisphere Institute last March named W. Connor and Associates as one of the world's most ethical companies and presented that award at a gala dinner in New York City, which I was honored to attend and was delighted that W. Connor was one of the 100 or so honorees, as well as HCA, and we'll honor HCA, our own Nashville company, at lunch today. But that's quite an achievement to be able to accomplish that in a culture such as the culture in Asia. And so we're interested to hear more from Chip this morning, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming to Nashville and to this Dean Institute event, William E. Chip Connor. Welcome, Chip. Well, we'll take questions from the audience, but again, let me sort of kick things off. Chip, I know that the term sourcing might be a little mysterious to people, and so maybe before we get into the meat of the conversation about the topic at hand this morning, let's talk a little bit about your business. What in the world is a sourcing company?
A sourcing company. Well, we have been around for 65 years, and I think what is the shelf life of an average Fortune 500 company? It's about 40 years, and so we've worked very hard to ensure that we're around for the long term, partnering with largely American companies, but also many European and Australian companies for global procurement. And I think to better understand, you know, the simple longevity of our company and what it is that we do, we have to go back, you know, to the genesis of the company 65 years ago and even earlier, when my father in the South Pacific was mustered out of the Army Air Corps in the Philippines. He had gone to language school in Everett, Washington. So here was a soldier that spoke a little bit of Japanese, and instead of competing with millions of others who were being demobilized by the armed services in the United States, he went to Japan. And he went to work as a civilian trade specialist under General MacArthur during the Occupation Administration, and his job was to oversee the importation of forest products into Japan. The company that he started in 1949 was a company that represented suppliers of forest products, lumber, paper, and pulp, from Scandinavia and from the United States for sale for the rebuilding of Japan. And if you know anything about what Japan was like back then, it was a wooden country, and the bombing raids in the early part of 1945, I mean, wreaked havoc to a degree that was almost unimaginable. But the one thing that he did at that time, which nobody else in Japan had ever done, was that he tried to bypass the large Japanese general trading companies, the Sogo Shosha, the Sumitomos, the Mitsubishis, the Nisho Iwais, and go directly to the mills, representing again the interests of the supplier. So fast forward to the 1950s, and Japan is starting to produce goods that Americans want to buy. And he's approached by a couple of American department stores, B. Altman in New York, Broadway in Los Angeles, both now defunct, and say, look, you know, we want to disintermediate the supply chain. We don't want to work with the middlemen. We need somebody. I mean, you speak Japanese. You've been there for the last 4 or 5 years. We want somebody representing our interest in the procurement of consumer goods in Japan. And that is what very much started the company that we're in now. Move forward to the 1980s. Again, I was personally born and raised in Japan, the oldest of 7 kids. The only time I ever lived in the United States was my college years. Back to Japan. Mother died very early. My father was losing interest in the business. We were largely a Japan-centric business, and in the wake of Kissinger and Nixon's visit to China, we could see clearly that there were opportunities opening up. So I acquired the company in the early 1980s, moved the headquarters from Tokyo to Hong Kong. I speak no Chinese. I speak Japanese reasonably well. And over the next 30 years, worked very hard to create a global footprint as opposed to a regional footprint. And today, we operate 35 offices in 20 countries around the world. We represent about 60 major firms, mostly American, but again, European as well. The TJX companies, Dillard, Marc Jacobs, Pier 1, Cost Plus, many very well-known firms. We employ about 1,500 people, and we operate, again, only as their representative in terms of procurement. They are outsourcing what they otherwise would have the resources to do themselves around the world.
I went back and checked the most recent ranking by Transparency International of the most corrupt countries in the world. And I believe China and India in that ranking were listed as equally corrupt, about 70th in the world. So these are cultures that are very difficult to maintain a high level of integrity, and yet you've managed, you've led a very complex organization. You've dealt with various manufacturers throughout Asia who perhaps don't subscribe to the same ethical standards as we do here. How have you done that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Asia is a wonderful place. I'm a creature, of Asia, having been born there. But you're absolutely correct. There are murky aspects to the business that I'm in that need to be combated virtually on a day-to-day basis. When I acquired the company and we moved out of Japan, we're still in Japan, but started to become global, we weren't seeing our associates on a day-to-day basis anymore. And the sourcing business crossed borders. China was opening up, Southeast Asia was opening up. So one of the first orders of business, I thought, let me back up and say that I'm the beneficiary of terrific parents. Both products of the Great Depression. They bring with them, an ethical way to lead life. This was inculcated into me at a very early age. It certainly characterized the business when my father was running it, beginning in 1949. But it wasn't so much as, I'm going to go out and run the business this way, we're going to live life this way. And so not lying, cheating, and stealing, and doing the right thing, and making sure our clients trust us was all part of it. But when you start to attenuate, when you start to move across borders, and as you say, in environments that can be very challenging from the standpoint of corruption and that sort of thing, you probably have to formalize your message a little bit. And so what I did was moved away from sort of the operating model of other companies in our industry. And that model is one of representing their client or their customer and collecting a fee from them or adding a margin in goods. But also, they have a financial interest in the vendor. They may provide raw materials at a profit to that vendor, all of which is not visible to their principal. And in life, if you want to get to the root of problems, sometimes all you got to do is follow the money. And we made a conscious decision, and we articulated it in our mission statement, that we will represent one interest, only that interest, and will represent that interest to the best of our ability. So the first order of business was define your business model in such a way that it was relatively unconflicted. Anybody that comes to work for you needs to understand that we are the alter ego of our client, and we have to act in their best behalf. So, that was the first order of business that we had to do. Secondly, we had to communicate that, and you don't just hit a magic switch on the wall and everybody becomes virtuous. It's something that we have to relentlessly police internally. But if you think about it, if I go to a company like the TJX companies and they're 22 or $23 billion, and I say to them, your core competency is retail and you're monumentally successful. And our core competency is global sourcing. We have a global footprint. We employ 1,500 specialists around the world. They're really good at what they do. We have an IT system which supports that. We want you to outsource that business to us. Well, if you can't add the additional value that we will provide that service in an atmosphere of absolute transparency and trust, these big companies with resources to replicate what we do would be doing it themselves. We may think we do it better, but believe me, they're not going to sign on to a multi-year partnership with us unless we can somehow ensure that the core business model is fully understood and the preservation of that model, that every one of our 1,500 associates, specialists around the world, of probably 30 different nationalities, understands it as well. So everything that we do, in addition to trying to operationally run a very, very effective company, be the best in breed, is also to reinforce all of the little things that you need to do to create an organization that enhances or supports or affirms that need for transparency and ethics.
Let's move to a little more generic view of your role as a leader, your philosophy of leadership. We've heard Ted talk about implementing virtues and values in the marketplace. Talk to us about your philosophy of how you, quote unquote, lead from the top.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, again, articulating the message and getting it out is very important. And the message is a very clear one. Will represent one interest again. And this was an extract from a letter that my father had written in 1951, and will represent that interest to the best of our ability. And sort of the corollary mission statement that we developed a little bit later was that we will be the partner of choice for large firms that sell consumer products anywhere in the world, and we're going to represent that interest in such a way that it is completely trustworthy and completely transparent. And so, you know, here I am as CEO of the company. I articulate the message. We have our intranet, and I put that out. I will tell you that at every stage, middle and the bottom, that message is validated as well. New employee orientation, new manager opening an office in Fuzhou, China recently. Everybody comes to Hong Kong and understands. You sit around dinners, that message is constantly reinforced. So first, you got to make sure people understand what it is that you stand for. And then the rest of the challenge is making all of that stick. And that is where the real challenge comes in. And just thinking of a few things that contributes to that. One is surround yourself with good people that are like-minded. And we're very blessed. I have a terrific management team. And in many ways, that management team becomes self-selecting because people are aware of what our reputation is. They want to come to us. They like working with us. And even in China, in Shanghai, if we're doing a new employee interview, and this wasn't the case, by the way, as recently as 5-6 years ago, that incoming employee will cite a desire to work for a clean organization, you know, as one of the reasons why they answered the job ad. So again, the people part of it becomes very important. The message part, you've got to get that message out, becomes very important. There's, you know, kind of an unscientific component to all of this that I'll call vigilance. And my own observation over 30 years in this business is that in general, especially in the challenging part of the world in which I live and operate, that the bad tends to subsume the good. In organizations, good people don't fight back against stuff that ought not to be going on. They quietly leave. And I think that if you look at the evolution of an organization over time, unless the values continue to be reinforced, eventually the bad will subsume the good. And we are constantly vigilant in every office. And again, there's 35 offices around the world in a number of different ways that I can speak to in a second, to make sure that the core ethic that I've articulated and can stand here in front of all of you and say time and again actually is followed through maybe it's one of the differences between kind of a hybrid American-Asian company, which we are, and a purely Asian company, is how you deal with things. But you have to be seen to act. And we have immense respect for human dignity. We don't humiliate, we don't yell, but when we find things in the company that are, awry, we will act on it. We won't just try to contain it. We actually will take fairly strong steps. We're perceived as being very fair, but we'll act on it. And then I guess the third leg of the stool is that we have engaged independent third-party whistleblowing firms that we don't control. And anybody inside our company, any vendor that works with our company, or even a client, can register on a completely anonymous basis an observation they may have made in terms of conduct of any of our employees. If they choose to remain anonymous, Ethics Point will make sure that that is respected. That information comes back to us, and we act on everything that we learn. So I don't know if it was Ronald Reagan that said, trust but verify. Well, that really does work. You have to come, forward, I think, with the general attitude that you do trust and respect people, but we don't just expect systems to take care of themselves. And so that vigilance part becomes very important.
Let me invite you to be thinking of some questions, and I'll ask another question while the audience prepares some, and then I'll invite the audience to submit a question or two also. I wonder, as a product of the Western culture, even though you grew up in Japan, most all of us here today are products of a largely Christian culture, so I'm sure your perspective is largely that perspective. What have you learned from the Asian mindset? Have you learned things that have actually caused you to modify your Christian perspective and improve that?
That's an interesting question. I think we have to look at it in really two levels. The headline issues are the same, I think, around the world. Aversion to corruption, self-dealing, theft, running a side business, lack of transparency. Those are all decried in virtually every one of the markets in which we operate. Where things, might be culturally a little bit different in Asia is that and it's a very admirable characteristic, by the way, but there's an aversion to confrontation. There is a tremendous respect for face or kao, and in dealing with problems, it tends to be perhaps a more amorphous, less direct dealing with things. And if you step back a little bit and look at how Asian companies are generally constituted, even today, about 70% of all companies in Asia, even large cap publicly traded companies, are either state-owned or state-controlled, I should say, in the case of China, or family. And so if you're dealing with a corporate environment where the natural predisposition of management is not to draw too much attention to ourselves, and if we find something bad going on, and you couple that with a constituency that is there not just because they came in for an interview, but because they may be there by virtue of associations, whether they be family or whether they be government. It makes it much more complicated to try to go forward and do whatever is necessary to eliminate the malfeasance in the company. Now, in our case, because our clientele is largely Western, and so much of the trust that they put in us is trust that requires reinforcement, and trust that requires that they perceive and understand that we don't tolerate, we don't adopt a containment strategy. As long as it doesn't get too bad, we'll tolerate it. It's more of an elimination strategy, and that elimination strategy, of course, is aspirational. I will tell you, we have problems in our company, and we've had to deal with them. But again, the approach is probably a little bit more of a direct approach than what we might find if we were a purely Asian company.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. Questions? Don't be timid. Well, let me keep the questions going while the audience thinks of some others. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. Oh, Andy.
Is there any area of sourcing that you feel you have to stay out of because it's simply so corrupt that you simply couldn't be in sector X of the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, many. And it's not areas in terms of a given population group, market, culture. It is more what you find, we call them zero tolerance issues. Child labor, for example, conscript labor. Workplace safety, we generally consider not a zero tolerance thing because, I mean, a factory, blocks exits, you find it, you put in a remediation plan, you work with them. And factory manager attitude is very important here. If you think they're, kind of pulling the wool over your eyes and on repeat business, you don't do it. So the no-go areas tend to be more on a company level. There are also, there's great ambiguity in terms of what constitutes, for example, child labor. One of the clients that we have is The Body Shop, and The Body Shop was founded by Anita Roderick. I mean, the amount of due diligence they did on us before they engaged us as their global partner was incredible. But the baskets and the things that go into their merchandise mix are frequently made on a crafts basis. And so you'll go into a village and the family is all kind of working together to weave those baskets. It's the only enterprise they have. Prosperity is coming to them by virtue of that. But if you were to, kind of objectively assess, well, their 12-year-old after school is sweeping the stoop. Well, I mean, does that constitute child labor or not? And the way a company like The Body Shop will deal with that for is not to disenfranchise that community, but to go in there and find out how can we make sure that it's salubrious? How can we make sure that person is going to be educated? And so we put people there. If we think that they're really, shackling people to the workplace, it'd be different things. So the no-go areas are out there. There's zero tolerance, and some companies are really pretty bad, and you want to stay away from them completely. But many companies, again, make mistakes. They want to improve. They want to be part of the global marketplace. And just to make one corollary statement to what you said, probably the bane of our existence, more than anything else, is illegal subcontracting. Because you will go into a factory and it'll be a gleaming, institution with the exits, with the dorms, everything. You check the payroll records, they're getting their overtime, they're getting everything else. But you find out that when you go into the warehouse for the final inspection, 20% of that product actually wasn't made there. And if you dig a little bit further, you find out that the place it was made was pretty awful. And you don't have visibility into that. Sometimes not at all, and sometimes only after you dig a lot. And so it's a great question with a very, very complicated answer to it.
Thank you so much.
I have to put in a plug for Dr. Andy Borchers, who asked that question. He is the chair of our management department, and it was under his leadership that we developed a brand new supply chain management program here at Lipscomb in partnership with Hong Kong College of Management in Hong Kong. Our students go there and their students come here. And so we're really excited about that, and we're excited
Wonderful.
about delving into the world of supply chain management under Andy's leadership. Other questions? Dick?
Vietnam and East Asia has emerged as a location for sourcing and competition for China. And I have observed that the Chinese government has built a terrific infrastructure into Africa, building roads and infrastructure for resource mining. Do you think that there is a future opportunity for Africa to be a sourcing location in the world that could compete with China because of the labor and the marketplace there? And is China interested in developing that market as a sourcing opportunity?
We source from Africa, Southern Africa, South Africa primarily. Africa, candidly, has a long way to go before they emerge as viable competitors to China, but they're making great progress. And I think that is going to come about largely through hybridized arrangements where you have probably Asian companies more than anything with a great deal of know-how on how to set up a factory, how you run production lines efficiently going in and setting things up in China. You have AGOA, you have the sort of the treaty, the duty credits and benefits for coming out of Africa. You have complex things like yarn forward rules and everything else. There's a lot that needs to be, I think, worked on before that happens. But, you know, everybody is talking about how wage rates in China are skyrocketing, and China is pricing itself out of the global marketplace in terms of comparatively low value-added manufacturers. Well, the truth of the matter is that, yes, you know, Chinese wages are rising at a spectacular rate. I mean, the government by decree has said that the minimum wage must rise by 13% every year for the last 5 years, and the reality for the last 5 years has probably risen by about 20%. But China is still competitive, and China is competitive because of a massive investment in infrastructure, both rail, more airports are being constructed in China alone than the rest of the world combined, the highway system, education, all of those things that go in to raising unit labor productivity are making China continue to be competitive, and it's also a huge country. Vietnam is 90 million people, right? And they are competing against China, but how long can 90 million compete against 1.3 billion? So China isn't going away. Southeast Asia is coming up. It's becoming more important for us. India, 1.1, 1.2 billion, should be doing a lot better than it is. Very inspired, very educated people, but unfortunately lacking the infrastructure and the cohesive government direction that you find in China. So then you move to Africa, and you look at what they're competing against. You know, Africa will emerge, but it's going to take a lot of help.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering what type of integrity development programs you might have for your employees who are moving up as they take on more responsibility within the company and have a greater stewardship over assets, if you train them.
Yeah, I think that, you know, getting the message out is pretty clear. Everybody in the company gets the message. Implementation is sometimes a little tougher because you have traditions in different, you have Diwali in India, which is a gift-giving season. You have Chinese New Year, where everybody gives the little red packs full of money and gift baskets and everything else. And so you kind of have to deal with each one of these countries a little bit differently. And we take, more or less of a no-compromise approach. We accept the fact that we have a $25 limit on gifts, and we ask everybody in the company, it's the honor system, but be sure you don't violate that, to respect it. The money part of it is absolutely a no-no. The packets full of money that everybody in China gives during Chinese New Year, we kind of buck the cultural trend. And so again, it's just at every small level, we just try to reinforce this idea that we don't want a conflicted business environment. We don't want people benefiting, from being associated with the company, being associated with the industry just because of tradition. Remember what it is that we stand for. And by the way, we can be disenfranchised by a very large account. We don't want that to happen. Fidelity is everything to us. The Dillard organization has been with us for 45 years. We have probably half of our clientele has been with us for more than 25 years. And that didn't happen by accident. That happens because on a microscopic day-to-day level, how do you live your life? How does the employee get a complaint about somebody, they ask for a kickback at an inspection for a fact, you act on it, and you need to be seen to be act on it. So again, it's not just sort of a policy that you develop and post in all the offices that you expect people to abide by. It's just working with all of those challenges as you deal on a global basis.
I referred to the triple bottom line in my opening remarks earlier this morning. Profits, of course, people, and planet. I wonder how your business is evolving to reflect things like social enterprise, social consciousness, corporate social responsibility. Do you see and interest among your employees in Asia, particularly the Asian employees, in things like corporate social responsibility?
We do. We do see that, and certainly it's something that I believe in very strongly. Again, we've been around for 65 years. We want to be around for a long time. And if you want to be around for 100 years, what is it that you have to do to be there? Well, it can't just be profits, right? You have to think about the welfare of people. You have to think about the planet. And it's an incredible oversimplification, but if you had a relationship with a customer or client that was worth $1 million in profit, and somebody could tell you that you have a choice, we will somehow guarantee that that association will last 25 years, but that profit has to be apportioned over that 25 years, or you could get it in the first 2 years and then figure out what you're going to do in year 3. Well, the investor community, which is why it's very helpful for us to be a private company, very much demands that you try to optimize the profit. But think about how much more easy it is for me to run the company, directing efforts operationally into tinkering with, performance. If I knew that I didn't have to respond to demand for ever increasing things. So the profit part of it, how do you establish the present value of a 25-year commitment? You really can't. So it's hard to quantify, but it is profit and it is longevity. And so if you have longevity, what is the quality of life as you exist in that circumstance going to be like? I can tell you that in Hong Kong, we started late having kids, but they're all kind of coming out of their teenage years. Their pediatrician in Japan, in Hong Kong, treats 10 times the number of respiratory cases a week than they did at the time my kids were growing up. It's
Really?
pollution. It's pollution. So, if we choose to live there, we choose to do business there, our employees are living there, may be profitable, but there are other quality of life issues that you need to be aware of. And then the people issue, my wife is very involved with special needs kids and serves on a number of boards globally and also in Hong Kong. I will tell you, as tough as we might find it here in the West to have a special needs child, if you're a cutter in Bangladesh earning $120 a month and you have a retarded son, life is pretty difficult. And so if you are committed to our business for the long term, and you want it to be, again, a salubrious one that benefits everything, you have to take into consideration all of those things. And again, being private helps us make decisions that lend itself more to that type of longevity and balance, I think, than if we were a public company.
Other questions? In the back.
You had mentioned how sometimes you want to do business with a company and sometimes up front it looks good, but you may get to the warehouse and realize there's some skeletons in the closet. Have you learned any tips to help improve your diligence process to maybe catch some of that a little earlier that you could share?
Again, there are many things that go into resolving that particular issue. Taking the sort of the headline is make sure you pick your partners carefully. There are great vendors in Asia, and there are some pretty bad ones. And so if you go with one, taking subcontracting, which I mentioned earlier, there's nothing wrong with subcontracting. It actually makes the supply chain, the overall dynamic, much more efficient if you can flex capacity in that way. It's just that the subcontractors need to be vetted at the same level as the main vendor. And so, picking the right vendor is very important. Secondly is boots on the ground. Okay, there are large American companies who seek to source direct from Asia, who will open an office in Hong Kong, maybe open an office in Shanghai. But the production is actually taking place in Fuzhou, it's taking place in Wuhan, it's taking place in Dongguan, it's taking place in Shenzhen. And they'll fly somebody in at the end to do an inspection, make sure everything's okay in the factory. We don't. We do spot checks. We have employees, we take them off premises for interviews for the social compliance part of the business that we do. So it's all of those things together that kind of go into to avoiding the oh my goodness surprise, where did this stuff come from, when you show up at the last minute. You want to catch that stuff very early.
Great question. Others? Yes.
commented on your vendors and how you screen them. What about on your client side? To what extent do you vet them and make sure there's somebody with whom you want to work?
You know, we're very blessed that we've had long-term relationships and on balance get along with clients really well. There have been some that we have chosen not to work with for any of a variety of reasons. I will say that in the wake of tragedies like the Rana Plaza disaster, the Tazreen fire in Bangladesh, that when I sit down with senior management of large companies, both American and European, the issue of integrity, the issue of social compliance, CTPAT or supply chain security are really at the forefront of discussion. Companies really are changing. Their consciousness of what their responsibilities are beyond, simply, helping the bottom line is much more tangible now than it was before. But there are still some that in my view, don't quite get it, and we tend not to work with them.
Going back to earlier, what you said about private and public companies, do you think that the manipulation of shareholders' value has that much of an impact on the ethical point of companies? And do you think that if you ever IPO your company to the public, how would you manage the crossover to be able to say, I'm going to stick with my morals and ethical means rather than look for the shareholder value? How would you do that management style?
I wish I knew. I don't know what my exit strategy is going to be for this company yet, but there's nothing to suggest that if the way you run your business is made very clear at the outset, and that the people who choose to invest with you understand that and understand the long-term perspective that we've taken, that we really want to make it to year 100, that we're going to kind of do it in a way that perhaps lowers our margins on a year-to-year basis, but maximizes the fidelity of a client and do that. So I think it's, and I may be totally naive on this, and the hawks of Wall Street will prove me terribly wrong, but I'm just hoping that the way I think about things and the way my colleagues in the company, by the way, think about things will see us through.
You've been in Asia throughout the past 6 years or so, since 2008. Ted referred to the tremendous losses caused by frauds and scandals in this country. How have we looked as America to you and the Asians during those years? How have the Asians thought and talked about us in Asia?
Believe it or not, largely in a very positive way. Let's not forget that so many of the executives that are joining our company at relatively junior levels have been educated in the United States and to a lesser extent Europe. And they bring back, you cannot go to college in this country without bringing back some of the social consciousness which permeates education here. And so the view is comparatively positive. One of the things that I find surprising is how much less cynicism, intrinsic cynicism about free markets and corporations that exists in Asia vis-a-vis here in the United States. It's extraordinary. Because of the one-child policy in China, you have a whole bunch of spoiled young Chinese who are the only kid in their family. But the one thing they're not is cynical. And I think that the reason for that is that poverty remains very proximate. It's a generation removed from many of the countries in Asia. I mean, if you, just some numbers, 30 years ago, China's per capita GDP was $300. It's approaching 7,000. There's been tremendous wealth creation, and with wealth creation comes a recognition that prosperity came through open markets. It didn't come because the corrupt officials in Guangdong suddenly decided to change their stripes, and serve the people better. So if there is cynicism, it's probably more directed to again, local governments more than the national government. I'm talking about China now. but not cynicism as far as corporations are concerned, or free enterprise or capitalism, because the prosperity is still very apparent to them. They remember, their parents remember the time when 60%, 1990, 60% of the Chinese population lived below the Chinese poverty line. Forget the American poverty line, the Chinese poverty line. That figure now is about 10 to 11%. Well, you know, you take that 30,000-foot view, scandals notwithstanding, you know, maybe there was some merit to what it was that we did. Income imbalances notwithstanding, you know, the increase in pollution notwithstanding, you know, overall we're better off. So that cynicism, which that I see actually, you know, quite poignantly in this country, we don't see in Asia.
We've got a lot of business deans and perhaps other academic disciplines represented in the room this morning. What would you tell us as deans to do or do differently in training our students for a more global marketplace? As they think about their careers, they will inevitably be a part of a flatter world.
Mm-hmm.
What should we be thinking about in terms of changing our curriculum, changing how we train future leaders?
Right. Well, there's so many things I think that you need to be cognizant of. I mean, first and foremost is structural. I think the inherent interconnectedness of all the economies in the world, you know, should be recognized. And the United States is so big and sometimes so insular that this is not recognized, and probably a device that we all have that reflects this is the iPad. Okay, that iPad may cost $700. It comes out of a Foxconn factory that employs 250,000 people in Dongguan, China. But that iPad, the China content, the actual China content of that iPad is between 5 and 10%. Of that $700, a great deal of the profit accrues here, the intellectual property is here, the microprocessors come from Malaysia, the scratch-proof glass is coming from, I think, South Korea, maybe I think from Samsung, going in there. So there's an amazing interconnectedness. I mean, you disrupt, you fail to recognize the interdependency that countries have in this type, and this is where the world is going. You short circuit yourself. In terms of, you know, if this question had been asked 10 or 15 years ago, it's appreciation of the differences in cultures, which would be very important. Don't think that everybody does things just the way Americans do things. Well, they don't do things just the way Americans do things. But by virtue of the sheer power of American education and business education and social values, things are changing globally. If you look at European companies, I think Daimler-Benz, the lingua franca of doing business in that company is now English. You know, that may even come to France, where you have the Académie Française that tries to quash any attempt to use English. And so businessmen here, those of you going into business, need to recognize that yes, it is all interconnected, but many of the values that you bring with you translate very well across borders. I mean, things as, how Disney loads a cruise boat is done better than anybody else in the world. How 2,000 people can, with smiles on their faces, get put aboard in 3 hours, I will never figure out. Doesn't happen anywhere else but here. And so there is so much greatness that exists in this country that is very exportable and very appreciated by people around the world. But it is interconnected. It is nuanced. Okay, they're not huge differences. There are cultural nuances that must be respected. But for the most part, that we are global is probably the single top line concept that I think we should all embrace.
Other questions? We've got time for maybe a couple more. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the cultural differences in how things are done in America, and that we shouldn't expect them to be done the same way in other countries. And you also mentioned not just enfranchising, the villages where the children are working. How do you explain cultural differences in the norms and like what America expects as far as labor goes to your clients, and how do you explain that internally also about the differences in what Americans expect and what is expected in the lower income nations?
Right. I think in the lower income markets, jobs are expected, and you know, again, a healthy health and safety, a good working environment, really the basics. You know, whether the TV is 1080 pixel or 720 is not questions that these people are asking. And so very, very basic values. We want to have jobs. We want to be treated fairly. And for companies that are seeking to do, and I should also back up, that example that I gave you about vendors for the body shop doesn't really typify much of our business. Much of our business are very modern, bright factories where you want to make sure people are being paid, overtime is accounted for, and everything else. But I think that understanding that things are very complicated, that the solution is one of relentless application of pressure and checking, and that there are some areas that are not black and white. There is ambiguity in life generally, and you kind of have to sit down, and you sit down with your client. And by the way, we have clients who will not work with that village that produces the basket if in fact any child was there. Well, you know, that's a failure to recognize, I think, the economic and the cultural dynamic of that little village, and whether it's right or wrong, not for us to decide. We elevate that information to our client to make the decision.
Other questions? We've really combated cynicism here, not just in Lipscomb, but I think in America. The events of the last 5 or 6 years have really created a certain cynicism, I think, among the millennials. All business people are bad. They end up in business, we all do, but they major in lots of other things because they think if they major in business that they have to become bad people. Have you seen that among millennials in Asia? Are they as cynical about that as our...
They're not. They're not as cynical. You know, the overall mood is shifting more in this direction because there are vast imbalances in income distribution in Asia, particularly in China. But if you take a macro view, overall there's a great deal more prosperity. And again, it remains very visible to the current generation, including the millennials, the kind of the youngest of the group. You know, I don't believe in the inherent goodness of mankind, and I don't believe in the inherent badness of mankind. You know, we are human, we make mistakes, whether that accrues to somebody in the private sector, the public sector, or anything else. And so the issue is to try sort of to codify, you know, conduct, to live life in a way, you know, and we're all flawed, to go forward. In this country, I think that the WorldComs, the Tycos, the Enrons, billion-dollar-a-year salaries on the part of people in the hedge fund industry, you know, don't go down well. I mean, and they are very much at the forefront, I think, of the coverage of business. And it can't help but influence perceptions to the negative. Mm-hmm. Now, in Asia, you know, the big problem until quite recently was not that Hutchison Whampoa has now controlled the docks in the Panama Canal, and oh, woe to us, what's going to happen? It's the fact that, you know, my uncle who had the farm where Shenzhen now stands had it misappropriated by an official who got paid off by the developer. Okay, so it's not all about vilifying companies, but you know what? Things are better off now. It's not perfect. There are flaws that come with it, again, pollution and fishery corruption. But it's not just the private sector. It's not the market mechanism that is making all of this bad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Chip, thank you and Jackie for coming all the way from Hong Kong to join us. You all are delightful, and we very much appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
I appreciate it. It's my first trip. I love it.